All right. Where I believe we left off last week, last Thursday, is we just got done finishing talking about psych definition of psychology, the goal of psychology, what psychology is and what it's not, and some of the myths. And we kind of did the comparison between what are known as pseudo psychologies and in the science of psychology to kind of show kind of the difference between the two different ways of trying to understand individual behavior and mental processes. So, what our job for today is to go over some of the classical problems that psychology has kind of inherited and tried to take on. And I should note, if you want to read more in depth about these, please look them up in the textbook. I'm going to kind of give the very truncated version for the sake of lecture and the sake of this class. But there is a lot more into these than what we have time for in a class or a presentation. So, and I do want to say is while we're going to take it kind of from the Western perspective um, um, about these different problems, we haven't found a society yet that hasn't tried to resolve these issues within their own culture. So I just want to kind of make that point, even though we're going to use some very Western philosophers and names, these problems tend to be kind of cross-cultural problems that human beings have been trying to figure out for years. And even today, with our modern tools and our modern research methods, these questions still are not fully answered. Okay. Um, so the first problem we want to take on is what's called the nature versus nurture problem. Okay. And the two individuals that we're going to use to explore the nature versus nurture problem is two people from the Greek times, Plato and Aristotle. Okay. Plato and Aristotle were both students of probably a very common philosopher that everyone may know, and that's Socrates. Socrates uh, has had a huge influence on things like how we discourse about law and stuff like that. In fact, there's something called the Socratic method that is still taught in law school today. And the Socratic method kind of goes like this. You continue to ask questions and questions and questions and questions until there can be no other answer possible. So, for example, when a attorney has someone on the stand, they continue to press that person until that person can no longer have any other reason that they may have committed that behavior or saw what they saw. Okay. But anyways, I'm digressing a bit. After Socrates passed away, actually I believe he was either hung or something like that. But um, there were two individuals who thought they would take over his school, and that was Plato and Aristotle. And what happened is Plato ended up with the school, and Aristotle, in his kind of frustration, left. And then he went on and uh, eventually developed his own school. He was the tutor to Alexander the Great for several years, and he very much was what we call a naturalist. Okay, and we'll start with him at this point. If we look at the Western maps and uh, um, categorizations of plants and animals and stuff. This started with Aristotle. He was the first to kind of categorize the different types of fauna and plants and animals and put them in categories such as prey and predator, those kinds of things. Um, and what he recognized is that uh, a plant survives well when it's put in an environment that serves its growth. So gives it the right amount of water, has the right kind of soil, has the right things in place for it to grow and be healthy. But plants who are in kind of what we call an impoverished environment, doesn't get much water, the soil is they fail to thrive in those environments. And so he took on what's called the nurture approach to understanding human development and growth. The nurture approach says we are who we are because of our experiences and our environment that we are raised in and that we experience. Okay. So he believes that we are a product basically of our learned experiences, our experiences through life. Plato, on the other hand, is going to take a different view. He's going to take what's called the nature view. And the nature view states that we're born to be who we are. That if we put it in this terms, uh, we inherit traits through the bloodline. If we put it in modern terms, we inherit all of our traits because of our genetic code. Okay. And so we are who we are because of genetics. And this is going to start kind of especially in Western culture, this is where you get the notion that a king is a king because his father was a king, and that a farmer is a farmer because his father and his father and his father were farmers. Okay, that we are born into place because of our bloodline. Okay, and so this notion is basically what we would, in modern terms, we call a genetic perspective of human behavior, that who we are, our personalities and everything are predetermined by our genetic code. Okay. And so today we kind of look at it from this perspective. How much of our who we are is due to experience versus who who are we based on our genetic code or genetics? Okay. And this is measured using what's called the genetic quotient. The genetic quotient tries to determine what percentage of who we are is because of genetics versus how much is due to experience. Okay. And I mentioned at the beginning of this that this is still very much a debate. Okay. Because, for example, personality is one of those things that a lot of people research because we want to know, are we who we are because our parents' personalities, and we got some from mom, some from dad, and or are we who we are because of our experiences? Like, and dependent upon the method you use, dependent upon the researcher that did the research, the genetic quotient for personality, dependent on the research article you read, is anywhere from 20%, and I've seen it clear up to like 60%. So this is why the nature versus nurture debate is still open, because dependent on the research you read determines how much your genetic quotient is. Now, I will say that if you're one of those individuals who strongly believes in the education, strongly believes in, making sure your kids get out and enjoy the community and interact with other people, you're leaning more on the nurture side of this debate. If you believe that everything that you're experiencing, let's say you have depression and you say, well, I have depression because my parents had depression, or you're leaning more towards the nature side. But as we will see as we go through this class, it's probably more like a combination of these two things that really make us who we are. But that the debate is still out there. Okay. A similar classical problem that it's very closely related to the nature versus nurture debate is the mind-body problem. And basically the mind-body problem is your mind and body two separate entities, or is the mind and the body one and the same? Okay. And probably the two philosophers that exemplify these two positions are Rene Descartes and John Locke. Okay. Descartes, he was actually commissioned to try and figure out this problem, um, and the way that he solved it is he was walking through, I believe it was some German gardens, and in these German gardens they had statues that if you stepped on a stone, for example, the statue would move in some way because of hydraulics. And I should note that Descartes believed that we basically a hydraulic system, that our blood makes it so our muscles move and whatnot. So what he came to state is that the mind and body are separate, because in order for basically our mechanical physical system to work, you have to have something acting upon it. Okay. That basically we're not, what is that called? We're not driverless cars. Okay. Um, um, we're not that advanced, is what Descartes would say, that we can exist without the driver, some driver in the driver's seat. And interestingly, he put the mind, that thing in the pituitary gland, which we'll learn isn't a very good place for the mind, but it's one of the irregular shaped things that is about in the center of the brain. So he decided, hey, that must be the seat of the mind. Um, so there's that argument, that the mind and body are two separate things. John Locke, I find it a very interesting person, because if Thomas Jefferson were to submit the Declaration of Independence to my class, I would have to give him a failing grade, because most of the Declaration of Independence was plagiarized off of John Locke's treatise on government. And let me kind of take you through this idea. What John Locke argued is that the mind and the body are one and the same. And that to be one and the same, that means we all have to be born the same. And so what he believed is that we were basically born with blank slates, or if we want to put it in modern terms, we're all born with blank hard drives for which experience writes upon. Okay. Now, for him, this was the only condition. This is the only way that we could be free. So he basically said, because we are all born with blank slates, we are all born equal, with the equal rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Those were John Locke's statements. They weren't actually Thomas Jefferson's statements. So in his notion, and if you could think about this, kind of has that nurture feel to it, right? Because it's going to be all about experience. But the larger part about it is what we call a monistic theory, that the mind and the body, there is no separation between the two. Okay. So again, if you feel like we have a soul, we have a spirit, if you feel that there's something about you that goes beyond your physical body, you're more on the dualist end of this philosophy. If you feel that we are basically what our brain is, and our brain is the mechanism that makes everything exist, you're more on the John Locke end of this. I will say, especially when we get to consciousness, this is another thing that is out there for debate, because when we think about consciousness, we can see that in the brain, that it is kind of like a CPU for a computer. It processes information, and there's a lot of electrical activity. Stuff goes to your occipital lobe, things go to your peripheral lobe so you can see 3D, temporal lobe so you can hear things, frontal cortex so that you can combine all those things and understand your experience. But what that doesn't tell us is, how are we experiencing this? Okay, if you think about a computer, you have the hard drive, but the hard drive is meaningless without the video screen, without the speakers. And the difficulty of taking a pure John Lockean version of this is we don't know how that electrical activity in the brain converts to sound, converts to sight, converts to thinking. Okay. So while it is, yes, if you damage certain parts of your brain, just like you damage certain parts of your hard drive, you no longer have access to that area. But we still have to contemplate the idea of how is it that we still, just because of that electrical activity, we experience what we experience. So just like the nature nurture debate, the mind body problem, regardless of whether you're dualistic or more on the singular level of understanding these, the debate's still out there because there's still, even with our modern technologies and whatnot, questions that we can't answer at this point. All right. So the next question, and it's worded the nature of man, but I think this needs to be replaced with the nature of human beings, is are we born good in nature? Are we born bad in nature? Are we born selfish, take advantage of other people, or are we born meant to be altruistic and helping with each other? And again, we'll use two Western philosophers, Hobbes and Rousseau. Hobbes is an English philosopher, and this philosophy is going to have a huge impact on American law and criminal justice and specifically what we do when people get convicted and sending them to prison and whatnot. Rousseau's philosophy is going to have an impact on law, government, and corrections in places like Norway, Finland, and other areas. And I'll explain why that is here in just a minute. But both Hobbes and Rousseau, why they're a good comparison, is because they both use nature to understand these tendencies in human beings. And what Hobbes going to do is he's going to look at nature and he's going to see a chaotic, destructive world. There's volcanoes and earthquakes and there's prey being eaten and torn apart. There's war, there's famine, there's all of these things. And so he's going to say if nature is chaotic and destructive, the nature of human beings is chaotic and destructive. Okay. And so we're born basically bad. Okay. Rousseau is going to look at nature a little bit different, and he's going to see this symbiotic relationship with anything in with everything. He's going to say volcanoes, yes, they're very violent, but they create new land. Yes, so the predator eats the prey, but then the predator defecates, which creates growth for the prey to eat. He's going to see these cycles in things. He's going to see that within any destruction, there's new growth. And so what he's going to say is that people are naturally good. And when a person becomes bad, it's because they're deviating from nature. They're deviating from their natural state. Okay. Now, I said this has influences on our law system. And so Hobbes states that the purpose of government, if we're born bad, the purpose of government is to control our evilness, to control people so they don't act on their natural tendencies. So we have laws about, sexuality. We have laws about, violence. We have laws about all of these things because all of these things need to be controlled because without them being controlled, then the world will fall into chaos. If you hear kind of that, the pro-life idea, you kind of hear this kind of Hobbesian idea about, well, if we just let every women have decisions over their bodies and the world's going to go crazy and blah, blah, blah. Okay. That's a very Hobbesian notion of this example of abortion rights. Okay. So what do we have to say about this? Well, we use a punishment system when someone does something bad. We put them away, get them away from society so they can't, quote unquote, infect the rest of the people around them and the like. It's a very much based on punishment. And punishment should just make them realize that they should obey the law. Okay. All right. And so let's now look at the other side of it. Let's look at countries who took on Rousseau's philosophy about people. Well, they take on an approach that when someone create has crime, they commit a crime, for example, that person has deviated from the community, they've deviated from society, they've deviated from nature. So the point of correction system, quote unquote, is to bring those individuals back to their natural state or back to nature. So literally a prison in Finland and Norway and whatnot, a prison in there is almost like going to a spa. You don't see the bars, you don't see any of those things. There's a very comfortable space. They're very comfortable places to exist and be. Okay. And so the question is okay, what ends up with the best result? This place where we're trying to bring the person back to the community, or this correction system where we want to take them away, put them away, and isolate their behaviors in this very confined place? Well, we can look at it from what's called a recidivism rate. Okay. Recidivism for the correction system is the probability that a person, after their first conviction, will return back into the correction system, back to prison. Okay, here in the United States, the recidivism rate is 60%. So a first-time offender has a 60% chance of going back to prison eventually. Okay. However, when we look at Finland, Norway, these countries who took more of this Rousseauing, bring people back to their nature, their recidivism rate is under 15%. Okay. And so what can we say about the state of this situation? Are people naturally good? Are people naturally bad? How should we manage these individuals who deviate from society? Well, again, this is something that we have healthy debates about. We'll talk about this more when we get to social psychology. We might take a side trip and talk about things like psychopathology and those kinds of things to kind of see, are people really this way? And again, there's arguments for both. The debate is still out there, but we can see the effects, societal effects, when we take a singular approach and we put everybody in a single basket. Either everyone is bad or everyone is good. Okay. All right. The last one really isn't a classical problem. It's a way of understanding things. And again, it's well, I'll just explain these. So we have two individuals. We have Wilhelm Wundt and William James. Just to give a background on these, Wilhelm Wundt is considered the father of scientific psychology because he was supposedly the first to open up a lab in a university in Germany. So he's the first one to establish a lab. William James is known as the father of American psychology because he was the first to write an American textbook on the topic. It's actually a fascinating read if anyone likes to read. It's 2 volumes, very interesting. He was very well with a pen. But they're going to come up with two different philosophies of how we should understand our mental and behavioral life. Wundt is going to be what we call a structuralist, okay? In that as long as you know the structures of the mind, you know everything you need to know about that mind, okay? And a good example of this is if you're a neuroscientist who discovers that a certain part of the brain elicits a certain behavior or a certain mental life, then you understand that just by knowing that location in the brain, it's been explained. Okay. A functionalist, on the other hand, is someone who says, okay, cool, you found an area of the brain that, yeah, is associated with that. That's cool. But what I want to know is what is the function of that behavior? What is the function of aggression? Why are we aggressive towards each other? Why are we attracted to some people but not others? What is the function of that? Um, and so they kind of go beyond and say, we just don't need to know what area of the brain. We need to know what purpose does that area of the brain or that behavior or process result in. So, if we take it like from, for example, a depression perspective, and this is where these things get complicated. A structuralist would say, okay, a person with depression responds to a medication that increases serotonin in the brain. That explains it. That's the structure. But a functionalist goes beyond that and says, no, we need to know the social and the emotional conditions. What are the conditions there that create that? What function is that depression serving in the person's life and the like? So it's kind of two different perspectives. Depression can be treated from either perspective, but what we found is a combination of those works the best. Okay. All right. I think that's the end of the classical problems in psychology. I need to hold on just a second. The one thing that I did want to present, and this is just one philosophy, and I want to make this very clear. One of the things I've learned out here on the Tohono Nation is the Tohono people have a very diverse notion of all the things we talk about here today. So this is just one perspective, one Otham perspective. It's created by a gentleman named Camillus Lopez, who is one of our instructors here at TOCC, but he is also an elder. I'd encourage anyone, if you're on the Otham Nation and he happens to be in that area to do storytelling or whatnot, I highly recommend it. It's very engaging. But what he's going to state based on what he knows about Otham history and the stories that are told is that as far as good or evil, he says uh, people have a duplicity of life, that individuals have both a tendency towards good and evil dependent upon the situation. That and when he brought up animals and whatnot, he brought up I believe it is the bon or the coyote, because I doubt I'm saying that right, and Otham. And how the coyote both has a devious nature, but he also has a helpful nature. And he says that's kind of that duplicity in life. And he also said that there's three aspects to individuals, not just the mind and the body, but we have a physical body that is here, that is meant for here to be here existing in the world. We have a mind that allows us to navigate this world. But he states that the mind and the body, when a person passes away, those both stay. Hence the rituals that we have and whatnot when it comes to funeral services and that. But there's something else called the soul or the spiritual self, according to him. And that is that something about you that transcends both the mind and the body. It's that essence of who you are. And that is the primary motivator for a person to exist in the world. Because our mind and our body make us do stupid things and good things. I shouldn't just say all stupid things, but good things. But it's that soul and spirit that keeps the person moving forward. So that's an example, and I would encourage everybody to look at your own communities and whatnot, and really kind of say, have these conversations about what your people, as I would say, think about these different aspects of existence. Okay, I'm going to actually skip that part and come back to it later. Okay. Is everyone okay? Are you both okay with the philosophy part? Is
Yes.
All right, everyone online okay so far? Following along.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Okay.
And I had a question as well. Sorry. I had a
Yes,
question
go
as
for
well.
it.
Okay, so I had seen that this class is online. Is it also on campus as well, or is it solely online?
So we have a Canvas page where all your assignments and everything will be submitted and all the learning materials are. But the class is a live class. I do post the recorded versions of these lectures in Canvas so that you can view them or if you missed a class.
No, I meant like on campus, like on
Oh,
is is it solely a online class, or do we have
no,
any?
no, I'm sorry. Yeah, no,
No, that's okay.
we have some people here on campus. We have two students here tonight, and I would encourage
I
anyone who
tried
is
to
here.
find you guys. That's why I was asking, because I was trying to find you guys. So I just ended up going online because I didn't want to miss it.
Okay. We're in room 123 in the how I forget the official name for the building. It's in the Arts and Science building um where the art studio is. Um how to explain this? So it's not in the other building, which is called GSK, where those four big classrooms. It's in the building right next to it. Does that
Thank
help? Okay.
Yes, it does. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. And thanks for coming. All right.
No problem.
I have a question.
Yes.
So it was nature versus nurture. Is that what it was? The the two um I don't want to say theories, but um so if somebody grew up and let's just say somebody was like a became a pathological liar and
Mhm.
and they had like a traumatic childhood, would that which would that do you think that that would fall under, like the would they, I guess some people would say, well, maybe they were born that way, but some people would say, well, it's because of their childhood, right? Is that kind of
Yeah, so that's the basis of it. Yeah, so it's and that's kind of the hard part about it, right? Is people who want to deny that someone had a traumatic past or that trauma can do that will say they're born that way, right? Um, and so the question is so um, pathological lying and everything. There that the evidence would suggest that that's more of a nurture thing, because when you live a life of trauma, one way to cope with that trauma or to l lessen the consequences of trauma is to either create a fake reality that you completely believe in or to lie. A lot of children learn to lie in order to get their parents from not hitting them, for example, or hurting them in some way. And so when we look at things like chronic lying and pathological lying, it often comes from the experience the individual has. Um, and it has become an adaptive part of them. Okay. Does that make sense?
yeah, that makes sense, because and that's kind of what I thought. It was based on personal experience versus inherited traits. Thank you.
Yeah. And and this is part of that complicates it because kind of going off of that note, if we look at depression as an example, okay, is depression genetic based or is it environmentally based? And the best explanation to this is that in it's probably a combination of both. One, most everybody in the class will experience depression at some point in your life. It's pretty much a statistical um, assurity. Okay. But for the mass majority of us, that depression will abate itself. Those symptoms will go away within 90 days. But there's other people where that depression tends to stay. It becomes a chronic issue. So that's a case of nature and nurture working together, because what has happened is some event in the environment has triggered the genetic predisposition for depression, and now it no longer takes an environmental trigger to experience that depression. So that kind of is the other side of the coin, as you would say. Okay. Any other questions?
Yeah, I
Yeah.
did.
So
All right. We just heard two voices.
yeah, wanted her to go first in case we were talking about or thinking about the same thing.
Oh, okay. So my question was kind of picking, piggybacking off of the other question, sorry, that she asked about what are some of the mental traits or um disorders. I hate using the word disorder, but what are some things that would count as um that philosophers have said that people are automatically born with, if that makes sense?
Sure, Annie. And again, I do want to go back that most all mental disorders, even if when they're genetically based, have to have an environmental trigger. So there can be people who have a predisposition to, for example, depression. And if they never experience the environmental trigger, their depression will never be triggered. But when we get to the abnormal section, we'll talk about disorders that are more organically based versus experientially based, or need that heavy combination of environment and genetics. Okay. And two disorders that come to mind is bipolar disorder and schizophrenia. Okay. Those two disorders tend to be very, very heavily influenced by genetics. In fact, there was a famous psychologist who trained clinical psychologists, and he would always go with his students and say, okay, what would you need to do to diagnose a schizophrenic? What do you need to do? What's the best way to be really sure that your diagnosis is correct? And they would go, well, you'd look at the symptoms. Are they hearing voices? Blah, blah, blah. And he would stop them right there. And he said, no, the best way you could be assured that the person has schizophrenia is if he has a brother or sister who has schizophrenia. Um, and so when we look at bipolar and disorders like those, bipolar is another one of those disorders that really can only it only can be treated through some type of medication or the like. But the reason why I like talking about bipolar is that there's another disorder called borderline personality disorder. Okay. And the reason why these are two really good examples is that uh, from an outside looking in behaviorally, bipolar looks very similar to borderline. You get these individuals who go through these severe manic phases, become very self-destructive, maybe having moments of creativity in some cases. They have these moments of high risk behaviors and all these kind of addictive type of things, and then they crash. They have these super low troughs where they're completely and totally depressed. Okay. And they go through cycles like that. Okay. Um, but the difference is that bipolar responds to medication. But if you give medication, say you misdiagnose a person who has borderline for bipolar, that bipolar medication actually makes them worse. So for example, when I worked in the prison, if we had someone come in with a diagnosis of bipolar, we would detox them completely off of their prescription, and we would reassess them. And most of the time we would find that they actually have borderline, they don't have bipolar. So we put them through a treatment modality for that, and guess what? They no longer find themselves back in the criminal justice system. And so this is an example, but borderline is the roots of borderline is when the family takes the family trauma, so the abuse that has happened in the home, the neglect and everything, and sweep it under the rug. Okay. And I've heard this from parents of borderlines all the time, that, you know, their adult child is going through hell and everything else, and the parents go, geez, I just don't know why. We gave them the best childhood ever. But the person is sitting there going, well, I was sexually abused by my brother. My dad was in and out of the house. My mom was constantly, you know, making me do all the chores and blah, beyond what would be normal for that child. But then you have the parents sitting there going, well, no, they had the best childhood ever. And that's the basis for borderline. Okay. So
Oh,
again, it's
sorry.
that combination, you know, some are more organically based, some are more environmentally based. So, Annie, did you have a comment?
Yeah, so I've done a little bit of research as well on borderline personality disorder. The thing I was curious about is that I've learned that it's often environmental and it develops over time. Is there also a possible way that people are born with borderline, the same way that you said that if bipolar and schizophrenia is in your lineage, you're more like prone to get to have that as well? Or is borderline solely one of those disorders that happens over time, like you explained?
Right. So borderline, the evidence for it is that it is environmentally based, but the issue is that it does run in families, but we can't find the kind of genetic component, because once we break that cycle of borderline, it stops following that family cycle. And so, and it's kind of this idea, you know, if you're born to a parent who has borderline, what are you going to learn, right? What are you going to learn from your parents' behavior? Well, you're going to learn those borderline tendencies. But we have found that when you break that cycle, that all of a sudden, for some reason, it doesn't follow the next generation. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you. That makes so much sense.
You're welcome. Thank you for the question. All right, there was another question. I believe, was it
Oh,
Christopher?
yes. Going back to genetic and your question down. Well, my question is, I- I'm stepping ahead a little bit about the native philosophy, but is native trauma still handed down by generation, but we the environmental part of the current situation?
You know what, Christopher, you bring up a very interesting. So you're kind of talking about the idea of historical trauma and those things, correct?
Yes.
I there it is actually. I'm going to say this from a scientific perspective. I think that the debate is out there, but there is some very, very interesting research that is being done that is actually aiming towards potential genetic markers that determine the how historical trauma affects an individual. So there's actually research right now on the genetic level that shows that that trauma is carried through the genes and the genetic code that you receive from your mom and dad. And it's really fascinating. I'm waiting for some replications on the research. I haven't seen any yet, but it's fascinating that there is that potential that historical trauma does have a genetic basis. Does that kind of help answer your question? But again, the debate is still out. The research needs to be replicated before it's um, we really can state uh, the state of the situation. I guess is what that didn't make sense, but we'll go with that. Does that?
Yeah, it does. And look, I do understand it. By
Can you say that again, Christopher? You're kind of breaking up on us.
and it just actually I should know that there is potential that there could be more generations to come to that conclusion to help the people with that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, and we will talk. I can't remember in which section we talk a little bit about historical trauma, but we'll come back to that topic. I can't remember what section it's. So we'll come back to that later on. Is there any other questions or comments?
Yeah, I did have a question. I'm not sure if um things like autism and other mental things like that are I guess they're considered learning disabilities. Would you consider people to be born with that, or is that something that also could develop as well?
So the evidence on autism right now is that it is biologically based. And again, we'll get to this, but I just think it's fascinating. The current theory of autism, and remember, we have autism on a spectrum. So you gotta think about these kind of so what I'm referring to is a child who is severely autistic. The current theory about autism is it's called the overwhelming world theory. Okay. Basically, if you think, with non-autistic people, we are constantly blocking out stimuli in order for us to experience our world. And one of my colleagues who studies autism stated it this way that if you want to be in the mind of someone who has severe autism, put yourself in the center of a room, put all kinds of lights flashing everywhere, and in one corner play country music, in another corner play classical music, in another corner play heavy metal, and then make sure the temperature is going up and down constantly, and there's wind or it's still, and that is the world of someone with severe autism. Because what seems to be missing in a child who is autistic is those filters to filter out stimuli that we don't need to pay attention to. So autism is considered a social disorder because the child is so overstimulated that they can't deal with the social world. So you have a lot of mothers who are sad because their autistic child doesn't like being hugged, for example. Well, if you think about that amount of stimulation, and then you add the stimulation of love and touch and nurturing to that, that just becomes totally overwhelming for the child. So there seems to be, in essence, according to current theories, is there something within that biological system that is preventing the child from filtering out unnecessary stimuli? Does that make sense, Annie? And that's just a current theory. I think the debate is still out on things like autism, but that's the current theory. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you so much.
Mhm. All
Oh, I
right,
have something to say.
go
So
ahead.
would that same thing go with because I did read something about and people or children developing what was it? Developing ADHD and all that from stuff that we eat, like everyday products that we eat, produce foods. Is that kind of like in the same category?
Yeah, and now ADHD is kind of a different situation, is because we really think that ADHD is an environment by biology interaction. that based upon the influences of social life and experience and everything else, that reacts with the individual's biological system that then creates the symptoms of ADHD. Now, the issue of you mentioned the issue of food and those types of things. That one's a little bit more difficult to parse out because it's kind of like you'll get research that says this certain toxin, right, can affect individuals or increase the probability that that child will get ADHD. But most of those results haven't been replicated in further research. And so it's one of those complicated things that, yes, we've found it once or twice in the research that we do, but by and large, all that research hasn't been able to replicate itself using a different methodology or a different way of looking at it. So, is there something probably to environmental toxin playing a role in some of these disorders? Absolutely. But I think that it's probably a combination of other things as well. Does that answer your question on where we're at with that right now?
Yeah, thank you.
Mhm. All right, any other questions? Okay. I want to conclude tonight because I want to make sure we move along in the class. I want to start going through some different theories. So it's a good time to get good old Sigmund Freud out of the way. And I'm just going to give an overview. We'll talk more detail about this guy when we get to the personality section. But what we're going to go through is we're going to go through some different camps of thought and psychology. We're going to do Sigmund Freud, and then we'll talk about the behaviorist movement, the humanistic movement, social psych. We'll go through all of these different camps of thought, but I really want to. The reason why we start with Sigmund Freud, which is the stereotype for psychology, is because he was one of the very first individuals from at least a medical or a biological perspective to give us a theory of mind, a theory of why we behave the way we behave. And just to give just some quick background on Sigmund Freud so you understand where he's coming from is he was actually trained as a scientist. He was trained as a neurologist in neurology. And he very much loves science. He was actually a part of going through his education. He interacted with some of the greatest minds in neurology at the time. In fact, I believe his dissertation was something about the nervous system of the frog, something like that. But because he came from Jewish descent, he wasn't going to be accepted in the science world. They were like, no, we don't want Jews in the science academies. So his only other option was to open a medical practice. Okay. And of course, because he was trained in neurology, he became a neurologist, doctor, and he started practicing in what even today we would consider neurology, phantom limb symptoms, those kinds of things. But one of the other things that he started to treat was certain types of mental illnesses, and the very common mental illness of that time was known as hysteria. Okay, hysteria is a condition. Now it's been parsed out to other disorders now, but it was kind of this kind of catch-all thing where an individual just became overwhelmed emotionally. So either they'd act out aggressively or they'd have large moments of what we call melancholy or depression. And it would come and go. It almost kind of, if you think about it in modern terms, more like kind of like bipolar or something like that. And it was seen largely as a female disorder. And hence the term hysteria. Okay, the Greek translation for hysta is the vulva, the female vulva, or the female reproductive part. Hence, a hysterectomy is the removal of the female sexual organs. because what it was believed that caused all this dysfunction and behavior and everything is that the womb was wandering around in the woman's body and creating havoc. All right. It sounds kind of silly, but you got to remember this was early 19th century, and modern clinical practice hasn't been developed. But I will state this, that is hysteria a female disorder? No, it's not. Early research actually found that more men actually had hysteria than women. More recent research says it's about half and half. So men and women have this disorder. Anyways, I'm kind of digressing on this issue. But one of Sigmund Freud's colleagues, Dr. Brunner, had a very famous client of hysteria who came to him, and we'll end kind of with the story, and we'll finish with his theory this coming Thursday. Is Brunner had this famous client who came to his office, and she said, you know, I'm bragging about you to all my friends. I want them to come talk to you and speak with you. And he was like, why? She said, well, after talking to you for a while, for several days after, I don't have any of my symptoms. I don't feel my hysterical symptoms anymore. And then when I come back and we talk again, I go in where I'm okay. And I'm telling my friends that you've developed what's called the talking cure. Okay. Now, any of you modern kind of counselors, social workers, therapists in the room, it would be, you know, bestow you to go back and kind of look at this from a historical perspective, because that talking cure is going to develop into psychotherapy, psychotherapy into counseling, counseling into the social work processes. So the roots of counseling and therapy start with Brunner and Freud, and Brunner and Freud are going to get together and say, okay, how can we quantify this? How can we formalize this? And he's going to come up with a theory of the unconscious, where individuals come to you and your goal is to help them understand how their unconscious mind is influencing their behavior. And this is going to be known as psychoanalysis. Okay. But what Freud is going to argue is that most of our behavior, in fact, the majority of our behavior, are motivated by unconscious drives. Now, remember, Freud wanted to be known as a scientist, so he's going to take probably one of the most famous scientific theories of the time. He's going to take evolutionary theory as his approach, Darwin's evolutionary theory as an approach to understanding and developing a theory of the mind. And what he's going to say is that if you look at evolutionary theory, it's a drive theory. It's an innate drive that what creates our survival are these things that we're born with to survive in the environment that we live in. And so Freud is going to come up with this notion of what does it take for human beings to survive in the world? What are two basic drives that start with the, if you want to say this, the first man and woman, and come through all exist in all of us clear up to today, that then motivate our entire life system. And he's going to say that there's two basic drives. There's the life instinct and the death instinct. Okay. That ultimately we're driven to, of course, procreate, to, if you put it in modern terms, spread our genetic seed. And we have the need to protect that through aggression and violence. And so he's going to narrow these two drives down to the sex drive and the aggression drive. That truly what drives us all is a tendency towards aggression and sex. And he's going to make an argument that we will get into next on this Thursday about why these two things drive all of our behaviors and mental processes. But the thing I want you to leave with here is the reason why I started with the story of hysteria is I want you to keep in mind as we delve into Sigmund Freud's theory, he based his theory on his clinical population. He based his theory on people who have had mental health issues, and then he generalized them to everyone else. And so with that in mind, I think I digressed a little bit too much, but with that in mind, I'm going to ask if I'll stop the recording. I'll stop sharing.